She buried her Medal of Honor beneath 40 years of corn and soybeans, thinking the soil could wash away what Afghanistan couldn't, until a collapsed storm cellar revealed a leather trunk that would force America to rewrite every history book. The documents inside bore Lincoln's private seal and confessions that 3 presidents had died to keep buried. Some truths wait a century and a half to surface, but when they do, they don't just change what we know about the past. They shatter everything we believed about who we are. The morning mist hung over the Miller farm like smoke from a dying campfire, heavy and gray, clinging to the Illinois fields with the persistence of an old wound that refused to heal. October in central Illinois had always carried weight, the kind that settled deep in the bones of those who worked the land, who understood that harvest meant both abundance and ending, celebration and loss. The corn stood ready, golden and brittle, whispering secrets to the wind that only farmers knew how to interpret. Sarah Beth Kowalski stood at the edge of her property line, her weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had grown cold an hour ago. At 58, she carried herself with the careful precision of someone who had learned to move through the world without making unnecessary noise. Her grey hair was pulled back in the same practical ponytail she'd worn for decades, and her blue eyes held the particular distance that came from seeing too much and saying too little about it. 23 years in the army had taught her many things: how to read terrain like scripture, how to lead soldiers through hell and bring them home whole, how to make split-second decisions that meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But nothing in her military training had prepared her for the hardest battle of all, coming home to herself after the war was over and the uniform came off for the last time. The farm had been her grandfather's, then her father's, and now hers, by default rather than design. She'd never intended to be a farmer. Growing up, she'd dreamed of horizons beyond the cornfields, of adventures that stretched past the county line. The army had given her those horizons, had taken her to places she'd only seen in National Geographic magazines as a child. But horizons, she'd learned, could be deceiving things. They promised endless possibility, but they also meant you were always running toward something that stayed forever out of reach. Afghanistan had been her 3rd deployment, the one that earned her the Medal of Honor and cost her everything else that mattered. The citation was specific about her actions on that October morning in Kandahar province, how she'd exposed herself to enemy fire to evacuate wounded soldiers, how she'd held a position for 6 hours while reinforcements fought their way through Taliban strongholds, how her leadership had saved 18 lives. What the citation didn't mention was how those same 18 soldiers had looked at her afterward, with a mixture of gratitude and something else she couldn't name. Awe, maybe, or pity, as if her heroism had somehow separated her from the ordinary world of worry and doubt and human frailty. The medal sat in a shoebox in her bedroom closet, wrapped in the flag that had covered her grandfather's coffin. She tried wearing it to Veterans Day ceremonies in the early years, but the weight of it felt wrong somehow. Not because it was undeserved. She knew what she'd done, knew the lives that had been saved, but because it seemed to define her in ways that felt too small and too large all at once. People looked at her differently when they knew about the medal. They spoke more carefully, as if her sacrifice had earned her some kind of special consideration that she'd never asked for and didn't want. So she'd come home to the farm, thinking that soil and seasons might provide the kind of rhythm that military life had disrupted. She'd thought that growing things might help her grow back into herself, might help her remember who Sarah Beth Kowalski had been before she became Colonel Kowalski, before she became a symbol of something larger than her own life. But farming, she'd discovered, was its own kind of deployment. The hours were just as long, the stakes just as high, and the enemy, weather, disease, market forces, just as unpredictable and unforgiving. The corn harvest was 3 weeks late this year. Wet spring had delayed planting, and now the weather couldn't seem to make up its mind whether to help or hinder. Yesterday's storm had been particularly vicious, one of those sudden Illinois thunderstorms that rolled across the prairie like an advancing army, all wind and fury and biblical amounts of rain. She'd watched it from her kitchen window, seeing the corn bend nearly horizontal under the assault, praying that 40 years of deep roots would be enough to keep her livelihood anchored to the earth. The storm had passed by midnight, leaving behind the kind of silence that felt almost aggressive after hours of thunder, but it had also left damage. Her equipment shed had lost half its roof. The old oak tree by the farmhouse had finally surrendered a limb it had been threatening to drop for years. And the storm cellar, the one her grandfather had dug during the Depression, the one that hadn't been opened in more than a decade, had suffered what looked like a complete collapse. Sarah had discovered the damage this morning during her routine walk around the property, the kind of inspection that every farmer performed after severe weather. The storm cellar had been built into a small rise behind the farmhouse, its entrance hidden by 40 years of volunteer growth and benign neglect. She'd known it was there, of course, but it had never seemed important enough to maintain. Modern weather forecasting and a sturdy basement had made the old shelter seem like a relic from a more fearful time. But now the entrance was exposed. The wooden doors that had covered it for decades split and scattered by the wind. More concerning, the earthen walls of the cellar itself seemed to have partially caved in, creating what looked like a sinkhole that dropped into darkness deeper than the original cellar should have reached. Sarah had stood at the edge, shining her flashlight into the void, trying to understand what she was seeing. The beam of light had caught something that didn't belong, a glint of metal, the edge of what looked like a wooden crate, and beneath it all, the unmistakable outline of dressed stone that had no business being 15 feet underground on a farm in central Illinois. It was the kind of discovery that raised more questions than it answered, the kind that made a person wonder what else might be hidden beneath the familiar surface of their own land. Sarah had always been methodical. It was a trait the army had, reinforced but not created. Even as a child, she'd been the kind of person who read instructions before assembling toys, who planned routes before going anywhere unfamiliar, who considered consequences before taking action. So she hadn't immediately climbed down into the collapsed cellar to investigate. Instead, she'd marked the location, taken photographs, and spent the afternoon researching property records and county geological surveys. What she'd found had been interesting but not particularly illuminating. The farm had been in her family since 1891, when her great-great-grandfather had purchased it from a railroad company that was selling off land grants. Before that, the property had been part of a larger tract owned by a consortium of Chicago investors who'd never actually lived on the land. Going back further, the records became vague, but there were references to the property being part of a federal land survey conducted in the 1870s and mentions of existing improvements that suggested someone had built something on the land. Before it was officially parceled and sold, the geological surveys were even less helpful. The land was classified as typical Illinois prairie, with rich topsoil over limestone bedrock. There were no mentions of caves or natural underground formations, no indication that anything unusual lay beneath the surface. But Sarah had spent enough time reading maps and analyzing terrain to know that official surveys didn't always tell the complete story. Sometimes the most important things were exactly what didn't make it into the official record. As evening approached, she'd found herself drawn back to the collapsed cellar. The autumn air carried the scent of drying corn and wood smoke from someone's fireplace, familiar smells that usually provided comfort, but tonight felt somehow ominous. The flashlight beam, stronger now in the gathering darkness, revealed more. details that daylight had obscured. The dressed stone appeared to be limestone, carefully cut and fitted in a way that suggested skilled craftsmanship. The wooden crate was actually one of several, all of them appearing old but well preserved in the dry underground environment. Most intriguing was what looked like the entrance to a chamber or tunnel carved directly into the limestone bedrock and extending beyond the reach of her flashlight. It was clear that whatever lay underground was much more extensive than a simple storm cellar. Someone, sometime in the distant past, had gone to considerable trouble and expense to create a hidden space beneath what would eventually become her family's farm. Sarah had served in enough unstable regions to recognize the signs of deliberate concealment. This wasn't a root cellar or a natural cave. This was something that had been specifically designed to remain hidden, built with the kind of care and secrecy that suggested its contents were valuable enough to be worth protecting at considerable risk. The question was what, and more importantly, why? Standing at the edge of the collapsed cellar as full darkness settled over the farm, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Genuine curiosity mixed with anticipation. For too long, her days had followed predictable patterns. Check the equipment, monitor the weather, tend to whatever crisis the farm presented, and try not to think too much about the life she'd left behind or the future that seemed increasingly uncertain. But this discovery represented something different, something that connected her land to a history she'd never known existed. Tomorrow, she decided, she would climb down into the darkness and see what secrets her grandfather's farm had been keeping. The rope ladder creaked against the limestone walls as Sarah descended into what she was beginning to understand was far more than a collapsed storm cellar. Her headlamp cut through darkness that felt ancient, untouched by daylight, for longer than anyone still living could remember. The air was cool and dry, carrying the mineral scent of deep earth and something else, the faint mustiness of old. Paper and preserved leather that made her think of libraries and archives. 20 feet down, her boots touched solid stone flooring. The chamber was larger than she'd anticipated, roughly rectangular, with walls that showed clear evidence of deliberate construction. Tool marks were still visible in the limestone, precise cuts that spoke of skilled stonework from an era when such craftsmanship was both common and essential. But it was the contents of the chamber that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Wooden crates lined one wall, each one carefully sealed and labeled with numbers rather than words. A heavy oak table dominated the center of the space, its surface bearing the water stains and ink marks of long use. Most remarkably, built into the far wall was what could only be described as a vault, an iron door set into a stone frame, secured with a lock mechanism that looked both sophisticated and ancient. Sarah moved carefully through the space, her military training keeping her alert for structural weaknesses or other hazards. But the chamber seemed remarkably well preserved, protected by the dry limestone environment and whatever care had been taken in its original construction. She approached the nearest crate, noting that its wood, while aged, showed no signs of rot or insect damage. The numbering system appeared to be chronological, starting with 1 near the entrance and progressing to 23 near the vault. The first crate was unlocked, its lid held in place by simple metal clasps that opened with gentle pressure. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be oiled canvas, were papers. Not just any papers, documents bearing official seals, handwritten letters, and what looked like transcripts of conversations or meetings. Sarah lifted the first document carefully, her hands trembling slightly as she recognized the distinctive letterhead of the Executive Mansion dated March 15, 1865. The handwriting was immediately familiar to anyone who had studied American history. Abraham Lincoln's distinctive script, with its careful formation and deliberate spacing, filled the page. But this wasn't a document Sarah had ever seen in any textbook or museum. It was a personal letter addressed to someone identified only as E.S., and its contents made her sink slowly onto a wooden stool that had been placed beside the table. "My dear friend," the letter began, "I write to you in the certainty that these words may be among my last as president, and possibly among my last as a living man. The burden of what we have accomplished weighs heavily upon me, not because I doubt its necessity, but because I fear the cost of truth may prove greater than our nation can bear. The documents you have helped me preserve tell a story that future generations must know, yet may not survive knowing." Sarah read the letter twice, then 3 times, trying to process its implications. This wasn't the Lincoln of popular memory, the great emancipator speaking in measured presidential tones. This was a man writing in private, expressing doubts and fears that had never made it into the historical record. More troubling were his references to documents and preservation, suggesting that what she'd found was not accidental, but part of a deliberate effort to hide information from public view. She opened the second crate, then the third, each one revealing more correspondence, more official documents, more evidence of a hidden history that existed parallel to the one taught in schools. There were letters from generals she'd never heard of, reports from government agents working in territories that weren't supposed to exist, and financial records detailing expenditures for projects that appeared nowhere in official federal budgets. One document in particular caught her attention. A military report dated January 1865, bearing the seal of the War Department but marked with classifications she didn't recognize. It described operations in District X, an administrative region that seemed to encompass parts of Illinois, Missouri, and territories further west. The operations detailed were unlike anything Sarah had studied in military history courses, not battles against Confederate forces, but missions designed to secure and transport sensitive materials and persons of strategic importance. As she read deeper into the cache, a pattern began to emerge. The documents told the story of a secret network, operating with Lincoln's full knowledge and authorization, designed to preserve not just Union victory, but specific information that the government believed could be destabilizing if revealed. There were lists of names, scientists, foreign nationals, escaped slaves who had provided intelligence, Native American leaders who had allied with the Union cause, along with detailed plans for relocating these individuals and their families to new identities in the years following the war. More disturbing were the financial records. The federal government had apparently been funding operations that went far beyond the scope of the Civil War. There were payments to agents in foreign countries, funding for technological development that wouldn't be publicly acknowledged for decades, and massive expenditures for what the documents called post-conflict stabilization that seemed to involve rewriting the historical record itself. Sarah found herself sitting in the darkness, surrounded by evidence that the America she had served and fought for was built on foundations far more complex and morally ambiguous than she had ever imagined. The Civil War, according to these documents, had been won not just through superior industrial capacity and military strategy, but through intelligence operations, foreign intervention, and systematic deception that continued long after Lee's surrender at Appomattox. One letter, dated April 10, 1865, just 4 days before Lincoln's assassination, was particularly chilling. Written in the president's hand, but unsigned, it was addressed to an unknown recipient and contained instructions for implementing what was called Protocol 7 in the event of his death. The protocol involved the activation of sleeper agents throughout the government, the suppression of specific documents and witnesses, and the gradual reshaping of public memory about the war's conduct and aftermath. "Should I not survive to see the peace," Lincoln wrote, "those who follow must understand that some truths serve the nation best by remaining hidden. The union we have preserved is more fragile than our victory songs suggest, and the methods we employed to secure that victory would test the conscience of even our most stalwart supporters. Let history remember the cause as just, even if history and cannot remember all the means by which justice was achieved. Sarah leaned back against the stone wall, trying to absorb the implications of what she was reading. Every document raised new questions, revealed new layers of complexity in events she had thought she understood. The Lincoln emerging from these papers was not the martyred hero of popular imagination, but a man who had authorized operations that would have been considered war crimes by modern standards, who had systematically deceived the American people about the scope and methods of Union war efforts. Yet the documents also revealed a leader grappling with impossible choices, someone who understood the moral cost of his decisions but believed the alternative, allowing the Union to fail, would be far worse. His letters to E.S. and other confidants showed a man tormented by the weight of secrets he carried, desperate to preserve both the Union and some record of the truth, even if that truth could never be safely revealed. As the hours passed, Sarah worked her way through crate after crate, each one revealing new aspects of the hidden history. There were technological specifications for weapons that wouldn't be officially developed for another 50 years, diplomatic correspondence with foreign governments that had never been acknowledged, and detailed intelligence reports on Confederate leaders that suggested Union forces had access to information that should have been impossible to obtain. Most shocking were the documents relating to Lincoln's assassination itself. Rather than the work of a small conspiracy led by John Wilkes Booth, the assassination appeared to have been anticipated and, in some ways, facilitated by Union intelligence services. There were reports suggesting that Booth had been under surveillance for months, that his movements on the night of April 14th had been tracked and predicted, and that certain security measures at Ford's Theater had been deliberately relaxed. The implications were staggering. If these documents were authentic, and everything about their provenance and condition suggested they were, then Lincoln's death had not been a tragedy that caught the government by surprise, but a calculated sacrifice designed to transform a controversial wartime president into a martyred symbol of national unity. The man who had authorized deception and manipulation in service of Union victory had become the ultimate victim of his own methods. Sarah found herself thinking about her own service, about the operations she had conducted in Afghanistan and Iraq that had never made it into official reports, about the moral compromises that war demanded from those who fought it. She had always been able to justify her actions by pointing to the larger cause, by believing that the ends justified means. That might otherwise be unacceptable, but these documents suggested that such justifications had been used to conceal operations far beyond anything she had imagined. The final crate contained personal items rather than official documents: Lincoln's reading glasses, a pen set that appeared to have been used for the most sensitive correspondence, and a small leather journal filled with entries in the president's handwriting. The journal was not a formal diary, but rather a collection of thoughts and reflections, many of them dated during the final months of his life. One entry, dated March 30th, 1865, was particularly haunting. "I have become a stranger to myself, authorizing acts that the young lawyer from Springfield would have condemned as unconscionable. Yet I cannot escape the conviction that these acts, however deplorable, may be the only path to preserving the Union that lawyer once swore to serve. History will judge whether I was a patriot or a tyrant, but it will judge from incomplete evidence, for the complete truth would destroy the very nation I have tried to save." As dawn light began to filter down through the collapsed cellar entrance, Sarah realized she had spent the entire night reading documents that could fundamentally alter American historical understanding. But she also realized that possessing this knowledge placed her in an impossible position. The documents were clearly authentic, their historical significance undeniable, but their potential impact on national consciousness was difficult to predict and possibly devastating. She thought about her grandfather, who had farmed this land for 60 years without ever knowing what lay beneath his feet. She thought about her father, who had served in World War II with an unshakable faith in American righteousness that these documents would have shattered. And she thought about herself, a decorated veteran who had built her sense of purpose around serving a country that, according to these papers, had been founded on secrets and maintained through systematic deception. The sun was fully up by the time Sarah climbed back to the surface, carrying with her just a single document, Lincoln's letter about Protocol 7. She needed time to think, to process what she had discovered, to decide what responsibility came with knowledge that powerful people had died to keep buried. The chamber below held answers to questions historians had debated for over a century, but it also held the power to reshape American identity in ways that might prove more destructive than illuminating. Standing in her kitchen, making coffee, with hands that still trembled slightly, Sarah Beth Kowalski found herself facing the most important decision of her life. She had sworn an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies. But what did that oath mean when the Constitution itself might have been preserved through methods that violated its fundamental principles? What did she owe to history, to truth, to the memory of those who had died believing in an America that might never have existed in the form they imagined? The Medal of Honor in her bedroom closet had been awarded for a single act of courage under fire. But courage, she was beginning to understand, sometimes meant not acting, not revealing, not sharing truths that others might not be ready to bear. The documents below would wait a little longer while she figured out what kind of courage this moment demanded. 3 days passed before Sarah could bring herself to return to the chamber. She spent those days moving through the familiar routines of farm life, checking equipment, monitoring weather forecasts, fielding calls from grain elevators about harvest schedules. But her mind remained fixed on the limestone vault and the iron door she hadn't yet opened. Every mundane task felt surreal, as if she were performing in a play while the real drama waited underground. On Wednesday morning, she drove to the county courthouse in Bloomington, ostensibly to check on property tax assessments, but really to spend time in the historical records office. The elderly clerk, Mrs. Henderson, had worked there for 37 years and possessed the kind of institutional memory that couldn't be digitized or outsourced. Sarah approached her with carefully casual questions about land grants and early settlement patterns, trying to understand how a secret chamber might have come to exist beneath what had been. According to all official records, ordinary farmland. Mrs. Henderson proved unexpectedly helpful, pulling out survey maps from the 1870s that showed the property differently than modern records indicated. Your land was part of something called the Federal Preservation District, she explained, spreading the yellowed papers across her desk. Never heard of such a thing before or since, but there it is in black and white. The whole area, maybe 2,000 acres, was under some kind of special federal jurisdiction from 1865 to 1873. Then it just disappeared from the records, parceled out to private owners like it had never been anything special. Sarah studied the maps, noting that the Federal Preservation District encompassed not just her farm, but several neighboring properties, all of them now owned by families who had farmed the land for generations. If there were other hidden chambers, other caches of documents, their owners remained blissfully unaware. The thought both comforted and troubled her. Comforted because it suggested the burden of knowledge might not rest entirely on her shoulders. Troubled because it implied the scope of concealed history might be far larger than she had imagined. That afternoon, She visited the university library in Champaign-Urbana, using her veterans' access privileges to research Civil War-era intelligence operations. What she found in academic journals and declassified documents from other conflicts painted a picture of American intelligence capabilities far more sophisticated than popular history suggested. By 1865, the Union had developed networks of agents throughout the Confederacy, had broken Confederate codes and communication systems, and had established protocols for information preservation that wouldn't be officially acknowledged for another century. Dr. Margaret Sinclair, a historian specializing in 19th century intelligence operations, had published several papers on what she called the hidden infrastructure of Union victory. Sarah found her office hours and presented herself as a graduate student, researching local Civil War history. Dr. Sinclair was eager to share her theories about government operations that had been classified for decades after the war's end. The Lincoln administration was far more sophisticated in intelligence gathering and covert operations than most people realize, Dr. Sinclair explained, her office walls lined with books and reproduction documents. They had to be. The Confederacy wasn't just a military opponent. It was a political movement with supporters throughout the North, foreign allies who might intervene, and access to resources that could have prolonged the conflict indefinitely. Winning required more than superior numbers and industrial capacity. She pulled out a folder of photocopied documents, many of them bearing classification stamps that had been removed only in recent decades. What fascinates me is the evidence of long-term planning. The Lincoln administration wasn't just thinking about winning the war. They were thinking about controlling the peace, shaping how the conflict would be remembered, ensuring that certain information never became public. There are references in State Department files to preservation protocols and legacy management that suggest they were planning for historical narratives decades in advance. Sarah asked about specific locations, about Illinois properties that might have been used for government purposes during the war. Dr. Sinclair consulted a database on her computer, cross-referencing property records with federal expenditures from the 1860s. "Interesting," she murmured, scrolling through entries. There were significant federal payments to contractors in your county during 1865 and 1866. Construction work, mostly, though the records don't specify what was being built. And there were payments to something called the Central Illinois Survey Company, which doesn't appear to have existed before or after those dates. The revelation sent a chill down Sarah's spine. The survey company had been a front, a cover organization for whatever construction work had created the chamber beneath. Her farm. The payments Dr. Sinclair had found represented the financial trail of a covert operation that had been buried in government records for over a century and a half. Someone had spent considerable time and money ensuring that Lincoln's documents would be preserved in a location that seemed innocuous enough to escape notice, but secure enough to survive for generations. Driving home that evening, Sarah found herself thinking about the isolation of her situation. She possessed information that could rewrite American history, but she had no framework for understanding what to do with it. The academic historians would approach it as scholarly discovery, but they might not fully appreciate the political implications. Government agencies would want to control the narrative, possibly suppressing information that proved embarrassing or destabilizing. The media would sensationalize discoveries without context, turning complex historical truths into partisan ammunition. More troubling was the growing certainty that she wasn't the first person to discover the chamber. The Federal Preservation District had been disbanded in 1873, but someone would have needed to know its location to arrange the land transfer. The chamber hadn't been forgotten. It had been deliberately hidden, its existence passed down through channels that kept it secure but accessible to those who might need to retrieve its contents. The question was whether those channels still existed, and whether her discovery would trigger responses from people who preferred the documents to remain buried. That night, Sarah returned to the chamber with better equipment. Work lights powered by a generator, a digital camera for documenting everything she found, and a metal detector to scan for other hidden compartments. She approached the iron vault with the careful methodology that military training had ingrained in her, photographing the lock mechanism from multiple angles before attempting to open it. The lock was more complex than it had appeared in flashlight. Illumination. Rather than a simple key mechanism, it required a specific sequence of rotations and lever manipulations. But someone had prepared for the possibility that future discoverers might not possess the original key or combination. Engraved into the iron door, visible only under direct light, were tiny numbers and symbols that formed a pattern. It took Sarah nearly an hour to decipher the sequence, but eventually the tumblers clicked into place and the heavy door swung open. The vault's contents were smaller in volume, but far more significant than the main chamber's document caches. Shelves lined the walls, holding not papers but artifacts, physical objects that provided evidence for the claims made in Lincoln's correspondence. There were weapons prototypes that wouldn't be officially developed for decades, samples of chemical compounds with notations in Lincoln's handwriting, and photographic plates showing faces and locations that didn't appear in any official Civil War documentation. Most remarkable was a collection of maps, hand-drawn but meticulously detailed, showing railroad networks, telegraph lines, and supply routes that extended far beyond the borders of the Union and Confederacy. These weren't military maps for conducting the Civil War. They were intelligence maps for managing the aftermath, showing planned reconstruction efforts, anticipated resistance movements, and contingency plans for federal interventions that might be necessary to maintain control of the defeated territories. One map particularly caught Sarah's attention. It showed Illinois and surrounding states marked with symbols that seemed to indicate hidden facilities like the one she had discovered. If her interpretation was correct, the chamber beneath her farm was part of a network of secret repositories, each one containing different aspects of the concealed history. The scope of the operation was staggering, a systematic effort to preserve information while ensuring it remained accessible only to those with proper authorization. She found authorization documents in a sealed envelope bearing Lincoln's signature and the Great Seal of the United States. The papers established something called the Continuity Protocol, a plan for preserving critical government information in the event of national catastrophe. The protocol authorized the construction of secure facilities, the recruitment of trusted custodians, and the development of communication systems that could function independently of official government channels. What made the documents particularly chilling was their assumption that such catastrophic threats would come not from foreign enemies, but from within the American political system itself. Lincoln had anticipated the possibility of future administrations that might attempt to suppress or distort historical records, future political movements that might threaten constitutional government, future crises that might require access to information that had been deemed too sensitive for public consumption. The Continuity Protocol had been designed to outlive the Lincoln administration, to function across generations and political changes, to preserve truth even when truth became politically inconvenient. Sarah was reading the foundational documents of what amounted to a shadow government, not a conspiracy to undermine democracy, but a system designed to preserve democracy by ensuring that certain information could never be permanently lost or distorted. As she photographed documents and catalogued artifacts, Sarah began to understand the full magnitude of her discovery. She hadn't just found historical documents. She had stumbled upon evidence of a parallel American government that had operated in secret for over a century. The implications for understanding not just the Civil War, but the entire course of American political development were profound and potentially destabilizing. Among the vault's contents was a leather portfolio marked with Lincoln's personal seal, containing what appeared to be his final instructions for the continuity protocol. The handwriting was shaky, suggesting the documents had been written during his final days in office, possibly even on the day of his assassination. The instructions were addressed to someone identified only as the Keeper, apparently the individual responsible for maintaining the network of hidden repositories and ensuring their security across generations. "Should these words reach you in circumstances of extremity," Lincoln had written, "know that the burden you bear is heavier than any one person should carry, yet lighter than the burden our nation would bear if these truths were lost forever. The documents you guard tell a story of imperfect men making imperfect choices in service of a perfect ideal. History will remember us as heroes or villains according to its needs, but you will know us as we truly were, human beings struggling to preserve something larger than ourselves." The portfolio contained detailed instructions for activating dormant elements of the protocol, for making contact with successor organizations, for determining when and how preserved information should be revealed to the public. But it also contained warnings about the dangers of premature disclosure, about the potential for truth to be weaponized by those who might use it to destroy rather than preserve democratic institutions. Sarah found herself faced with the central paradox of her discovery. The documents she had found were evidence of government deception on a massive scale, proof that American history, as commonly understood, was fundamentally incomplete and in some cases deliberately falsified. But they were also evidence of a system designed to preserve democratic government by ensuring that future generations would have access to the information necessary to understand and correct the mistakes of the past. Lincoln's final instructions made clear that the decision about revelation was not his to make, but belonged to future guardians who would better understand the political and social context of their own times. The continuity protocol had been designed to function across centuries, with each generation of keepers responsible for determining when their society was ready to confront the full complexity of its origins. As dawn approached, Sarah realized she had become part of a chain of custody that stretched back to the Lincoln administration. The chamber beneath her farm wasn't just a historical repository. It was an active system designed to remain functional until the information it contained was no longer needed, or until American democracy had evolved to the point where it could safely confront the full truth of its foundations. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders as she climbed back to the surface. She was no longer just a farmer who had made an interesting discovery. She had become the keeper, the guardian of secrets that could reshape American consciousness or destroy American confidence, depending on how they were revealed and how they were received. The decision about what to do with Lincoln's hidden legacy was now hers to make, and that decision would affect not just historical understanding, but the future course of American democracy itself. Standing in her kitchen as the sun rose over the cornfields, Sarah Beth Kowalski understood that her life had changed irrevocably. The chamber below would wait for her next decision, but it would wait as more than a historical curiosity. It would wait as a test of her judgment, her wisdom, and her understanding of what democracy required from those entrusted with its deepest secrets. The first attempt at understanding what she had inherited began with Sarah's decision to decode the authentication systems Lincoln had established for the continuity protocol, The documents in the vault had referenced verification procedures, ways to confirm the legitimacy of information and establish communication with other elements of the network. Sarah approached this challenge with the systematic thinking that had served her well in military intelligence, but she quickly discovered that 19th century security methods were far more sophisticated than she had anticipated. Lincoln's system relied not on passwords or keys, but on knowledge that could only be possessed by someone who had legitimately discovered one of the repositories. The documents contained references to specific historical events, personal details about Lincoln's associates, and mathematical formulas that could only be verified by cross-referencing multiple sources. Sarah found herself conducting what amounted to a graduate-level research project in Civil War history, spending hours each day in university libraries and online archives, tracking down obscure references and verifying details that most historians had overlooked or dismissed as unimportant. The process was painstaking but revelatory. Each authentication requirement led her deeper into the hidden history of the Lincoln administration, revealing networks of communication and cooperation that had operated entirely outside official channels. She discovered that many figures she had assumed were minor players in Civil War history had actually been central to covert operations. Telegraph operators, railroad conductors, newspaper editors, and small-town merchants had formed an intelligence network that spanned the continent, passing information and resources through channels that left no trace in official records. More troubling was what she learned about the continuation of these networks after Lincoln's death. The assassination had not ended the continuity protocol, but had triggered its transformation into something more permanent and autonomous. Andrew Johnson and subsequent presidents had apparently been briefed on certain aspects of the system, but control had gradually shifted from elected officials to career government employees and trusted civilians who could maintain continuity. Across administrations and political changes, Sarah's research led her to obscure genealogical records, tracking the descendants of people mentioned in Lincoln's correspondence. Some names appeared repeatedly across generations, families that had maintained their connection to the protocol for over a century, passing down responsibilities and knowledge through inheritance rather than official appointment. The realization that the system she had discovered was not historical artifact but living institution sent shivers down her spine. The breakthrough came when she successfully authenticated herself to what the documents called the primary repository, located, according to the coded instructions, somewhere in the vicinity of Springfield, Illinois. The authentication process required her to send a letter to a post office box that had apparently been maintained since 1865, using specific phrases from Lincoln's private correspondence and including a photograph of herself holding a particular artifact from the vault. The response arrived exactly 10 days later, delivered not by postal service but left in her mailbox during the night by someone who had approached her farm without triggering the motion sensors she had installed around the property. The envelope bore no postmark, no return address, just her name written in the same careful script that had characterized Lincoln's most sensitive documents. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an address in Springfield and a time, Saturday 2 p.m., come alone. Bring the authentication materials. The address led to a modest Victorian house in a residential neighborhood near Lincoln's tomb, the kind of well-maintained property that suggested comfortable middle-class ownership without calling attention to itself. Sarah arrived precisely at the specified time, carrying a briefcase containing photocopies of key documents and the authentication artifacts that had been specified in Lincoln's instructions. She approached the front door with the wariness of someone who had learned to expect ambushes, but also with the curiosity of someone who desperately needed answers. The woman who answered the door was perhaps 70 years old, with silver hair, pulled back in a simple bun, and eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. She wore a cardigan and sensible shoes, looking for all the world like someone's grandmother, but there was something in her posture and manner that suggested competencies far beyond the domestic sphere. "Mrs. Kowalski," she said simply, "we've been expecting you for quite some time." The interior of the house was unremarkable: comfortable furniture, family photographs, the accumulated possessions of a long life lived quietly. But the woman, who introduced herself only as Helen, led Sarah to a basement that proved to be anything but ordinary. The space had been converted into what could only be described as a command center, with filing systems that spanned entire walls, communication equipment that ranged from antique telegraph keys to modern encrypted computers, and maps that showed not just the United States, but networks of connections that spanned the globe. The Kowalski Farm repository has been inactive since 1923, Helen explained, settling into a chair behind a desk that seemed to serve as the nerve center of the operation. "We knew it was still there, of course, but the last keeper died without passing on the location codes. We've been waiting for someone to discover it naturally, which the protocol specifies is the proper way to identify new custodians. Your grandfather came close several times, but he never quite found the entrance. You have better timing." Sarah found herself struggling to process the implications of what she was seeing. The basement contained evidence of an organization that had operated in secret for over a century and a half, maintaining Lincoln's continuity protocol across generations and political upheavals. Helen spoke of it matter-of-factly, as if managing a shadow government were no more unusual than maintaining a family business. "How many repositories are there?" Sarah asked, setting down her briefcase, but keeping her hands visible in the instinctive manner of someone accustomed to potentially hostile meetings. 17 currently active," Helen replied, consulting a ledger that appeared to be handwritten in the same style as Lincoln's original documents. 3 have been compromised over the years and had to be relocated. 2 were lost during natural disasters. The Kowalski site brings us back to our original complement of 23, which Lincoln calculated was the minimum necessary to ensure preservation across multiple generations. Helen explained the structure of what she called the network, a loose confederation of families and individuals who had inherited or been recruited into the protocol's maintenance. There was no central authority in any conventional sense, no single person or organization that controlled the system. Instead, different repositories specialized in different aspects of the preserved history, with Helen's Springfield location serving as a coordination point for authentication and communication. "What's in my repository?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer from her examination of the documents. "Presidential materials, primarily," Helen confirmed. "Lincoln's personal papers, documentation of the most sensitive wartime operations, and the foundational documents for the protocol itself. It's one of the most complete collections, which is why it was placed in such a secure location. Your great-great-grandfather was selected specifically because his family had no political connections, no reason to attract government attention, and a demonstrated commitment to land stewardship that suggested the repository would remain stable for generations. The revelation that her family's acquisition of the farm had not been coincidental but carefully arranged sent a chill through Sarah. My ancestor was recruited? Recruited is perhaps too strong a word, Helen said gently. He was approached by agents who represented themselves as investors looking for reliable farmers to purchase specific properties. The offer was generous enough to be attractive, but not so generous as to seem suspicious. He never knew what lay beneath his land, and neither did his descendants until now. The protocol required that activation wait until someone with appropriate capabilities discovered the repository naturally. Sarah realized that her military background, her security clearance, her demonstrated ability to handle classified information, all of it had been factors in determining when the repository would be revealed. The storm that had collapsed the cellar entrance hadn't been the trigger for discovery, but merely the catalyst for a process that had been designed to unfold when the right person with the right qualifications encountered the right circumstances. "What happens now?" she asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. Helen opened a folder and withdrew a thick document packet. "Now you become a keeper, if you choose to accept the responsibility. The role involves more than just maintaining the repository. You become part of the network, with access to information from other sites and responsibility for contributing to collective decisions about revelation timing and public disclosure." The packet contained what amounted to a comprehensive briefing on American history as understood by the network. Not the sanitized version taught in schools, but the complete record of covert operations, foreign interventions, domestic surveillance, programs, and political manipulations that had shaped the country's development. Sarah flipped through sections dealing with Reconstruction, the Spanish-American War, both World Wars, the Cold War, and events extending into the present day. "This is still active?" she asked, noting references to operations from the previous decade. "The network has evolved considerably since Lincoln's time," Helen acknowledged. "We are no longer focused primarily on preserving information about the Civil War. Our mission has expanded to include documentation of any government operations that might be subject to historical revision or political suppression. We serve as a kind of insurance policy for democratic transparency, maintaining records that ensure future generations will have access to accurate information regardless of contemporary political pressures." Sarah found herself thinking about her own military service, about operations she had conducted that had never been officially acknowledged, about the classified information she had handled that the public might never learn about. "Are there records of recent military operations? Afghanistan, Iraq, and other deployments are documented in the Milwaukee repository," Helen said. "The network believes that military personnel have a particular obligation to ensure that their service is accurately recorded, that the costs and consequences of warfare are preserved for future analysis. Your own actions in Kandahar province are documented there, along with context that the Medal of Honor citation couldn't include. The idea that her most difficult moments, her most private struggles with the moral complexity of warfare, had been preserved in some secret archive, was both comforting and disturbing. Comforting because it suggested that someone understood the full context of what she had endured. Disturbing because it meant that even her most personal experiences had been subject to documentation and analysis by people she had never met. "Why maintain secrecy?" Sarah asked. "Why not make this information public? Let historians and citizens decide what they need to know." Helen's expression grew thoughtful, as if she were considering how much to reveal about the network's decision-making processes. "We've wrestled with that question for over a century. Lincoln believed that democracy required informed citizens, but he also believed that some information could be destabilizing if revealed without proper context or timing. The network has developed protocols for gradual disclosure, for releasing information when society is ready to process it constructively rather than destructively." She gestured toward a wall covered with newspaper clippings and printouts from online sources. "We monitor public discourse, political stability, social tensions. When the network determines that specific information can be revealed without causing more harm than good, we find ways to make it available to historians, journalists, or government officials who can use it responsibly. Sometimes that process takes decades. Sometimes it takes longer." Sarah studied the wall, noting references to recent political controversies and social movements. The network wasn't just preserving history, it was actively managing the pace of historical revelation, determining when American society was ready to confront the more troubling aspects of its development. The power implied by such decision-making was staggering, and the potential for abuse seemed enormous. Who decides? She asked. Who determines when society is ready for truth? The keeper's vote, Helen said simply. All 17 active repositories have equal voice in decisions about revelation timing. We require consensus for major disclosures, majority approval for minor releases. It's not a perfect system, but it's served us well enough to preserve democracy for a century and a half. The briefing continued for several hours, with Helen explaining the practical aspects of repository maintenance, communication protocols, and the responsibilities that came with keeper status. Sarah learned about the financial resources available to the network, about legal protections that had been carefully established over generations, about contingency plans for government interference or public discovery. But the most sobering part of the briefing was Helen's explanation of the psychological challenges that came with possessing information that could reshape public understanding of American history. Knowledge of this scope changes how you see everything, she warned. Every news story, every political debate, every public ceremony takes on different meaning when you know the full context. Some keepers have found the burden unbearable. We've lost several over the years to various forms of breakdown. As evening approached, Sarah realized she was facing the most important decision of her life. Accepting keeper status would provide her with answers to questions she had never known to. Ask would give her access to the most complete record of American political development ever assembled. But it would also burden her with secrets that could never be shared casually, with knowledge that would forever separate her from the comfortable assumptions that most citizens carried about their country's history. Standing in Helen's basement, surrounded by evidence of a shadow history that stretched back to Lincoln's assassination, Sarah Beth Kowalski understood that she had reached a point of no return. Whatever choice she made would define not just her own future, but her relationship to the country she had sworn to serve and the ideals she had been willing to die for. The chamber beneath her farm would wait for her decision. But it would wait as more than a historical curiosity. It would wait as a test of whether she was ready to become a guardian of truths that democracy might not survive knowing or might not survive without knowing. The search for other keepers began 3 weeks after Sarah's meeting with Helen in Springfield. She had agreed to join the network, signing documents that formalized her role as custodian of the Kowalski repository, but acceptance came with immediate responsibilities that extended far beyond maintaining the chamber beneath her farm. Helen had explained that the network functioned through personal relationships and direct contact between keepers, avoiding digital communications or centralized record-keeping that might be vulnerable to government surveillance or cyber intrusion. Sarah's first assignment involved traveling to Milwaukee to meet with Dr. James Whitmore, the keeper responsible for military records from 1945 onward. Helen had provided only basic information. Whitmore was a retired Army colonel who had served in Vietnam and Desert Storm, had discovered his repository in 1987, and had been documenting classified operations for over 3 decades. The meeting was essential because Sarah's military background made her uniquely qualified to help evaluate recent materials that had been accumulating without proper analysis. The journey to Milwaukee felt like stepping into a different world, one where every civilian she encountered carried secrets she could only begin to imagine. During her years of military service, Sarah had grown accustomed to the compartmentalization of classified information, to knowing that her security clearance provided access to only a fraction of what the government actually knew. But the network represented something far more comprehensive, a parallel information system that cut across all aspects of government operation, maintained by civilians who had no official oversight or accountability. Whitmore's repository was hidden beneath a used bookstore in Milwaukee's historic Third Ward, access through a basement entrance that appeared to lead only to storage areas for inventory overflow. The bookstore itself seemed to be a legitimate business, specializing in military history and political science. But Sarah quickly realized it also served as a screening mechanism for identifying potential contacts or threats. The elderly proprietor, who introduced himself simply as Frank, engaged her in conversation about her interests that seemed casual but was clearly designed to assess her knowledge and motivations. After 20 minutes of careful questioning about her research interests and military background, Frank led her through a door marked "Employees Only" and down a staircase that descended much further than the building's structure should have allowed. The basement had been extensively modified, with concrete reinforcement and climate control systems that protected documents from deterioration. Unlike the 19th century craftsmanship of her own repository, this facility showed evidence of modern construction techniques and electronic security measures. Dr. Whitmore was waiting in what he called the evaluation room, a space lined with filing cabinets and equipped with document scanning equipment, authentication tools, and communication devices that suggested connections to information networks far beyond the traditional library resources. He was tall and lean, with grey hair and the kind of bearing that marked career military officers even decades after retirement. His handshake was firm, his eye contact direct. But there was something in his manner that suggested the psychological toll of maintaining secrets for over 30 years. "Helen says you're the Kowalski site keeper," he began without preamble. "Good timing. I've been accumulating materials from Afghanistan and Iraq operations that need evaluation by someone with direct experience. The contractors who supply information aren't always reliable about context or significance, and I've learned not to trust my own judgment about operations I didn't personally witness." The materials Whitmore showed her were staggering in scope and disturbing in content. File after file documented military operations that had never been publicly acknowledged, civilian casualties that had been systematically underreported, intelligence, operations that violated both international law and military regulations. Sarah found herself reading after-action reports from missions conducted by units she had served alongside, operations she had participated in that were described in documents marked with classification levels she had never seen before. Most troubling were the personal files, psychological evaluations of soldiers who had reported war crimes, surveillance records of veterans who had spoken publicly about controversial operations, and what appeared to be contingency plans for managing public relations crises if specific information ever became public. The network had documented not just military operations, but the systematic efforts to suppress information about those operations, creating a comprehensive record of government deception that extended far beyond what any single whistleblower could reveal. "How do you get this information?" Sarah asked, studying a document that detailed operations she remembered participating in, but described decisions and motivations she had never been briefed about at the time. "Sources everywhere," Whitmore replied, his tone suggesting this was a conversation he had engaged in many times with new keepers. Military contractors who believe in accountability, intelligence analysts who keep copies of reports that get buried, soldiers who document things their commanders would prefer forgotten. The network has been building relationships with conscience-driven personnel for over a century. People want their service to be accurately recorded, even if they can't speak publicly about what they've witnessed. Sarah realized she was looking at her own psychological evaluation reports, documents that detailed her response to combat stress, her questions about mission parameters, her private conversations with military chaplains about the moral complexity of warfare. Someone had been watching her, documenting her reactions and concerns, preserving a record of her internal struggles that she had believed were confidential. The violation of privacy was profound, but so was the recognition that her experiences had been deemed worth preserving as part of the historical record. "Why document this?" she asked, though she suspected she understood the answer. Why preserve evidence of things that could damage military morale or public support for necessary operations? Whitmore leaned back in his chair, his expression growing thoughtful. Because the alternative is worse. When militaries operate without accountability, when governments can classify information indefinitely, when the public never learns the true costs of warfare, then democracy becomes meaningless. Citizens can't make informed decisions about war and peace if they don't understand what war actually involves. He gestured toward the filing cabinets that lined the walls. Every document here represents someone's decision to choose historical accuracy over institutional loyalty. That doesn't make them traitors. It makes them patriots who believe that democracy requires truth, even when truth is uncomfortable. The network exists because official channels for accountability have proven inadequate. The conversation continued for hours, with Whitmore explaining how the military documentation process worked within the broader network structure. Unlike the Civil War materials in Sarah's repository, which were historical artifacts, the modern materials required active collection and analysis. Keepers like Whitmore maintained contact with sources throughout the military and intelligence communities, providing secure channels for people who wanted to ensure their experiences were accurately recorded. Sarah learned about the network's role in several major historical revelations, Pentagon Papers, Iran-Contra, aspects of the Iraq WMD intelligence failures, where network-preserved documents had provided crucial context for journalists and congressional investigators. But she also learned about information that remained classified within the network itself, materials too sensitive for public release, but too important for destruction. "We're not WikiLeaks," Whitmore emphasized. "We don't believe in indiscriminate disclosure. Every revelation is carefully considered, timed for maximum public benefit and minimum damage to legitimate security interests. Sometimes that means waiting decades for the right moment. Sometimes it means never releasing information that would serve no constructive purpose." The distinction troubled Sarah, who had spent her military career believing in clear chains of command and official accountability mechanisms. The network represented a form of shadow oversight that operated entirely outside democratic institutions, making decisions about information release based on criteria that no elected official had approved and no public process had legitimized. Yet the alternative, leaving such decisions entirely to government officials who might have political motivations for suppression, seemed equally problematic. As evening approached, Whitmore introduced her to the practical aspects of maintaining contact with potential sources. The network had developed sophisticated methods for identifying military personnel who might be willing to provide information, for establishing secure communication channels, for protecting sources from retaliation. Sarah found herself being briefed on tradecraft that rivaled anything she had learned in military intelligence training, techniques developed over generations for managing sensitive information in hostile environments. "The hardest part," Whitmore explained, "is determining who to trust. Every source has motivations that go beyond historical accuracy. Some want revenge against commanders they believe wronged them. Some want to rationalize decisions they regret. Some are testing the network's security on behalf of government agencies. Learning to evaluate source reliability while protecting source identity requires judgment that comes only from experience. Sarah realized she was being invited into a community of people who had sacrificed normal lives for the burden of preserving truth that others preferred forgotten. Whitmore spoke of colleagues who had spent decades maintaining repositories, who had given up conventional careers and family relationships for the responsibility of being guardians of secrets. The psychological toll was evident in his manner, the careful speech of someone who had learned never to speak carelessly, the watchfulness of someone who had learned to expect surveillance, the isolation of someone who possessed knowledge that couldn't be shared with friends or family. The evening concluded with Whitmore providing Sarah with contact protocols for reaching other military-focused keepers, people who specialized in different conflicts and time periods. She learned about repositories that documented covert operations in Central America, nuclear weapons programs that had never been publicly acknowledged, intelligence operations that had targeted American citizens during the Cold War. The scope of hidden history was vast enough to rewrite entire decades of American political development, but Whitmore also warned her about the dangers of becoming too absorbed in the hidden history, of losing perspective on the broader context of American democracy. The network preserves evidence of government failures and deceptions, he said, but it also preserves evidence of government successes and necessary secrets. The goal isn't to destroy faith in democratic institutions, but to ensure that those institutions remain accountable to truth, even when truth is inconvenient. As Sarah drove back to Illinois, she found herself thinking about the weight of responsibility that came with network membership. She had joined believing she would be maintaining historical documents, preserving important information for future scholars and citizens. But she was discovering that the network was an active organization, continuously collecting and analyzing information, making decisions about revelation timing that could affect contemporary political debates and policy decisions. The realization that she was now part of an organization that operated parallel to official government, that possessed information capable of influencing elections and policy debates, was both exhilarating and terrifying. The network represented the ultimate check on government secrecy, ensuring that democratic accountability could function even when official oversight mechanisms failed. But it also represented a form of power that existed entirely outside democratic control, wielded by people who had been selected through accident and inheritance rather than election or appointment. Returning to her farm, Sarah looked at the cornfields and familiar buildings with new understanding. The land that had seemed like refuge from the complexity of military service had become the foundation for even greater complexity. The chamber beneath her feet contained not just historical documents, but active intelligence that connected her to ongoing operations, contemporary controversies, and future decisions about American democracy. The search for understanding had led her not to answers, but to deeper questions about the nature of democratic accountability, the proper balance between transparency and security, and the responsibilities that came with possessing information that could reshape public understanding of their government. She had become a guardian of secrets that democracy might require to survive, but she was also part of a system that operated in shadows democracy was never supposed to tolerate. Standing in her kitchen that night, looking out at fields that concealed one of the most important repositories of American political history, Sarah Beth Kowalski realized that her journey was just beginning. The network had accepted her as a keeper, but becoming an effective guardian of democratic truth would require her to navigate moral and practical challenges that her military training had never addressed. The chamber below waited not just as a repository of past secrets, but as a gateway to ongoing responsibilities that would define the rest of her life. The human connection Sarah had been seeking within the network materialized in an unexpected form 3 months after her meeting with Whitmore. It came through a coded message delivered to her farm by a young woman who appeared at her door on a rainy November evening, claiming to be a graduate student researching local agricultural history. The visitor, who introduced herself as Elena Vasquez, seemed legitimate enough. She carried university credentials, asked knowledgeable questions about farming practices, and possessed the kind of earnest enthusiasm that characterized genuine researchers. But something in Elena's manner, a careful precision in her questions, and an unusual familiarity with property records from the 1860s, suggested purposes beyond academic research. After 20 minutes of conversation about crop rotation and soil conservation, Elena asked casually about the old storm cellar, mentioning that county records indicated unusual construction activity on the property during the Civil War era. The question was delivered with studied casualness, but it carried the authentication codes that identified Elena as a network contact. Sarah invited her inside, ostensibly to continue their conversation about agricultural history, but actually to begin the careful process of verification that network protocols required. Elena's credentials proved authentic when subjected to the tests Helen had taught her: references to specific documents, knowledge of authentication procedures, and most importantly, a small artifact that matched descriptions in Lincoln's original instructions. She was, Eleanor explained, the keeper responsible for the Western Territories repository, located in a former mining facility outside Denver. What made Eleanor's visit significant was not just her role as a keeper, but her age and background. At 32, she was the youngest person ever to inherit network responsibilities, having discovered her repository only 18 months earlier following her grandfather's death. Unlike the other keepers Sarah had met, who had decades of experience managing secrets and maintaining historical perspectives, Elena brought the urgency and idealism of someone still processing the scope of what she had inherited. Elena's grandfather, Miguel Vasquez, had been recruited into the network during World War II, when his work as a translator for military intelligence had brought him into contact with documents related to American operations in Latin America. The Western Repository specialized in materials related to territorial expansion, Native American relations, and covert operations in Mexico and Central America that had never been officially acknowledged. Elena had inherited not just the repository, but a family tradition of documenting government actions that affected Hispanic and indigenous communities throughout the American West. The hardest part, Elena explained as they sat in Sarah's kitchen, rain drumming against the windows, is understanding that my grandfather spent 60 years maintaining records of things that destroyed communities like ours. Reading about operations that displaced entire populations, that manipulated elections in sovereign nations, that treated human beings as obstacles to American economic interests. But he believed that preserving the evidence was the only way to eventually achieve justice. Sarah found herself drawn to Elena's perspective, which brought a moral clarity that her conversations with Helen and Whitmore had lacked. The older keepers spoke of historical preservation and democratic accountability in abstract terms, but Elena understood the network's mission in deeply personal ways. Her repository contained documentation of government policies that had directly affected her family, her community, and millions of other Americans whose experiences had been marginalized or erased from official histories. Elena had brought with her samples from the Western Repository, documents that revealed the scope of American territorial expansion beyond what textbooks acknowledged. There were records of military operations against Native American communities that continued decades after the Indian Wars were supposedly concluded, detailed plans for annexing additional Mexican territory that were abandoned only due to international pressure, and correspondence between government officials and private companies that amounted to conspiracy to defraud indigenous nations of their treaty rights. More disturbing were documents related to the Mexican-American War that provided context for material Sarah had found in her own repository. Lincoln's papers had referenced territorial stabilization operations that she hadn't fully understood, but Elena's documents revealed them as part of a systematic program to secure American control over conquered territories through methods that violated both international law and constitutional principles. The Civil War, according to these documents, had been preceded by decades of covert operations that established precedents for federal authority that would later be used to justify Reconstruction policies. "This is why the network matters," Elena said, spreading photocopied documents across Sarah's kitchen table. Official histories treat the Mexican-American War as a brief conflict over territorial boundaries, but these documents show it was part of a 50-year campaign to establish American hegemony over the entire continent. The techniques developed for controlling Mexican populations were later used against Confederate territories, and then against labor movements, and then against civil rights activists. There's a direct line of institutional learning that connects 19th century territorial expansion to modern domestic surveillance. Sarah studied the documents, recognizing patterns that connected to her own military experience. The counterinsurgency techniques she had learned in Afghanistan had roots that extended back to operations against Apache communities in the 1880s. The intelligence-gathering methods used against suspected terrorists bore striking resemblance to surveillance programs developed for monitoring Mexican-American communities during the territorial period. The network had preserved evidence of institutional continuity that revealed American military and intelligence operations as part of an unbroken tradition stretching back to the earliest days of westward expansion. Elena's passion for the material was infectious, but also troubling. Unlike Helen's measured approach to historical revelation or Whitmore's strategic thinking about information release, Elena advocated for immediate and comprehensive disclosure of network materials. She believed that American democracy could only be preserved by forcing the public to confront the full scope of government deception, regardless of the short-term consequences for political stability or public confidence. "People have a right to know," she argued, her voice carrying the intensity of someone who had spent months processing devastating revelations about her country's history. "Every day we delay revelation is another day that policies based on lies continue to harm communities that have already suffered enough." The network was created to preserve truth, not to manage public consciousness according to our own political preferences. Sarah found herself torn between Elena's moral urgency and the cautionary warning she had received from other keepers. Elena's arguments were compelling, but they didn't address practical questions about how society would respond to learning that fundamental assumptions about American history were false. The network had preserved evidence of government actions that would be condemned as war crimes if committed by other nations, documentation of systematic racism and exploitation that extended across centuries, proof of deception so extensive that it called into question the legitimacy of democratic institutions themselves. Their conversation continued late into the night, touching on questions that went to the heart of democratic theory and practice. Elena argued that democracy required informed citizens, regardless of how uncomfortable the information might be. Sarah countered that democracy also required stable institutions, and that revelations poorly timed or inadequately contextualized could produce political chaos that would ultimately serve authoritarian rather than democratic ends. The debate revealed fundamental tensions within the network itself. Elena represented a younger generation of keepers who had inherited responsibilities they hadn't sought but felt moral obligations to fulfill through immediate action. Sarah and the older keepers represented a more cautious approach that prioritized long-term preservation of democratic institutions over short-term demands for transparency. Both positions reflected legitimate concerns about democratic accountability, but they led to completely different conclusions about network responsibilities. Elena had brought more than documents and theoretical arguments. She had also brought evidence that the network's careful approach to information management was being challenged by external forces that threatened both secrecy and eventual revelation. Government surveillance programs had become sophisticated enough to detect patterns that might compromise network security. Private intelligence companies were using advanced data analysis techniques to identify anomalies in public records that could lead to repository discovery. Most concerningly, foreign intelligence services had apparently become aware of the network's existence and were actively seeking to exploit American historical secrets for their own political purposes. "We're not the only ones with access to hidden history," Elena warned, showing Sarah intercepted communications that suggested Chinese and Russian intelligence services had identified several network sites and were attempting to recruit keepers or steal materials. "If we don't control the timing and context of revelations, others will do it for us. Better to reveal truth on our own terms than to have it weaponized by people who want to damage American democracy rather than strengthen it." The security concerns added new urgency to questions about network future and purpose. Sarah realized she was part of an organization that existed in an increasingly precarious position between domestic political pressures and international intelligence threats. The network had been designed to operate in relative obscurity, preserving information until American society was ready to process it constructively. But global political dynamics and technological developments were making obscurity increasingly difficult to maintain. Elena proposed what she called graduated disclosure, a systematic program of releasing network materials through carefully selected historians, journalists, and government officials who could provide appropriate context and analysis. Rather than waiting for perfect timing that might never arrive, the network would begin a managed process of revelation that could extend over decades but would ensure that critical information entered public consciousness before it could be suppressed or stolen by hostile forces. The proposal required approval from all active keepers, which meant Sarah would need to take positions on questions she was still learning to understand. Elena was asking her to vote on policies that could reshape American political discourse, influence international relations, and determine whether the network continued to exist or evolved into something entirely different. The responsibility was staggering for someone who had stumbled upon the organization by accident and was still processing the scope of what she had inherited. As Eleanor prepared to leave the next morning, she provided Sarah with communication protocols for reaching other keepers who shared her perspective on immediate disclosure. The network, Sarah realized, was not the unified organization that Helen had described, but a loose confederation of people with different philosophies about democratic accountability, historical preservation, and moral responsibility. Her vote on Elena's proposal would align her with one faction or another, defining not just her own role, but the future direction of an organization that had operated in shadows for over a century. Standing in her farmyard as Elena drove away, Sarah found herself thinking about the fundamental question that underlay all network activities. What did democracy require from those entrusted with its deepest secrets? Elena's visit had provided no easy answers, but it had clarified the stakes involved in decisions she could no longer avoid making. The chamber beneath her feet contained not just historical documents, but active intelligence that could influence contemporary political debates, international relations, and the future of democratic accountability itself. The human connection she had found with Elena was both comforting and troubling. Comforting because it provided someone with whom she could share the burden of knowledge that had been isolating her from normal social relationships. Troubling because it revealed that even within the network, there was no consensus about how to balance competing demands for transparency, security, and political stability. The organization that had seemed to offer clear moral purpose was actually struggling with the same questions about democratic responsibility that plagued official government institutions. Sarah realized she was approaching a decision point that would define not just her own future, but her understanding of what patriotism required in a democracy built on secrets. The network had accepted her as a keeper, but becoming an effective guardian of democratic truth would require her to choose between competing visions of how truth should serve democracy and how democracy should serve truth. The chamber below waited for her decision, but it waited as more than a repository of past secrets. It waited as a test of whether American democracy could survive the full truth of its own history, and whether that survival required continued secrecy or demanded immediate revelation. The external pressure began on a Wednesday morning in January, when 3 black SUVs appeared at the end of Sarah's driveway, their occupants making no attempt to conceal their surveillance of her property. She first noticed them while performing her routine morning inspection of the equipment shed, their presence immediately recognizable as government vehicles, despite the absence of official markings. The timing was not coincidental. Elena's graduated disclosure proposal had been circulating among network keepers for 6 weeks, and someone with access to government intelligence resources had apparently detected the increased communication between repositories. Sarah approached the situation with the tactical awareness that military training had ingrained in her, using the cover of normal farm activities to observe the surveillance team while considering her options. The vehicles maintained their positions for exactly 4 hours, their occupants photographing everyone who approached the property and using equipment that suggested electronic monitoring of communications. At noon, they departed as suddenly as they had arrived, but their message was clear. The network's activities were no longer operating beneath government notice. That evening, Sarah received an encrypted message through network channels that confirmed her suspicions. Similar surveillance had been detected at repositories in Milwaukee, Denver, and Springfield, suggesting a coordinated government effort to identify and monitor network activities. Helen's response was characteristically measured, advising all keepers to maintain normal routines while implementing enhanced security protocols. But Elena's message, received an hour later, carried a different tone entirely. The government pressure validated her arguments for immediate disclosure before network materials could be suppressed or confiscated. The pressure intensified over the following weeks through methods that stopped just short of direct confrontation. Sarah's farm was subjected to surprise inspections by agencies that had never shown interest in her property before. Environmental regulators checking soil composition, agricultural inspectors verifying compliance with crop rotation requirements, tax assessors conducting routine property valuations that required access to areas near the concealed chamber entrance. Each visit was technically legitimate, but the cumulative effect was clear intimidation designed to discourage activities that someone in government wanted stopped. More troubling were the indirect approaches to network keepers themselves. Whitmore reported being contacted by former military colleagues who claimed to be writing memoirs, but asked suspiciously specific questions about his current activities and associations. Elena's university received an unexpected grant offer that would require her to relocate to Washington, D.C. for a 3-year research project on territorial history. Helen's Springfield neighborhood experienced a sudden increase in real estate activity, with buyers expressing unusual interest in properties near her residence and offering prices significantly above market value. The government's approach was sophisticated enough to avoid obvious legal violations while creating maximum psychological pressure on network members. Someone with detailed knowledge of each keeper's personal circumstances was orchestrating a campaign designed to isolate, relocate, or compromise key network personnel without triggering the kind of direct confrontation that might generate public attention or legal challenges. The operation bore the hallmarks of intelligence community work, subtle, deniable, and precisely targeted to exploit individual vulnerabilities. Sarah found herself thinking about her grandfather's stories of government pressure during the McCarthy era, when federal agents had visited farms throughout the Midwest, searching for evidence of communist sympathies or foreign influence. The techniques being used against the network were more refined, but reflected the same institutional paranoia about citizens who possessed information that government officials preferred to control. The irony was profound. An organization created to preserve democratic accountability was being targeted by the democratic government it sought to serve. The breakthrough in understanding government intentions came through Elena's contacts at the university, where intelligence community recruiters had become unusually active in approaching graduate students who specialized in American history. The recruiters were specifically seeking people with expertise in Civil War-era documents, 19th-century intelligence operations, and historical authentication techniques. Elena realized that the government was not merely seeking to suppress network activities, but was preparing to counter them with competing narratives and alternative interpretations of preserved materials. Elena's analysis proved prescient when a series of academic articles began appearing in prestigious history journals, authored by scholars with previously undistinguished careers, but suddenly possessing access to classified materials that contradicted key elements of network documentation. The articles challenged the authenticity of documents that network keepers had spent decades verifying, proposed alternative interpretations of historical events that minimized government deception, and suggested that much of what appeared to be systematic institutional misconduct was actually the result of misunderstandings or subsequent mythologizing of ordinary bureaucratic confusion. The counter-narrative campaign was brilliantly executed, using legitimate academic channels to plant doubt about historical conclusions that network revelations might support. Rather than attempting to suppress information directly, government strategists were inoculating public consciousness against revelations by preemptively discrediting the evidence on which those revelations would be based. When network materials eventually entered public discourse, they would be dismissed as already debunked conspiracy theories rather than evaluated on their own merits. Sarah recognized the strategy from her military experience with information warfare in Afghanistan, where psychological operations had been used to undermine insurgent recruitment by discrediting their political narratives before those narratives could gain popular support. The same techniques were being deployed against the network, but with resources and sophistication that suggested involvement by the highest levels of intelligence community leadership. Someone very powerful had decided that network activities represented a threat requiring systematic neutralization. The pressure campaign reached a climax when Sarah received an official visit from representatives of the Department of Homeland Security, who arrived with a warrant to search her property for materials related to ongoing national security investigations. The warrant was suspiciously specific, authorizing searches of areas that corresponded almost exactly to the chamber's location and requesting access to documents that matched network materials in general terms without revealing detailed knowledge of their contents. Sarah's military background proved invaluable in managing the search, as she was able to engage with the federal agents in professional terms while using legal knowledge acquired during her security clearance processes to limit the scope of their investigation. The chamber entrance was concealed well enough to escape detection during a surface-level search, but she realized that more intensive investigation would eventually locate it. The government was clearly operating on inside information about network activities, suggesting that surveillance had been more comprehensive than any keeper had realized. The search warrant contained language that suggested government knowledge of specific documents, including references to Civil War-era correspondence of potential intelligence significance and materials related to historical preservation protocols established during the Lincoln administration. Someone with detailed familiarity with network contents was guiding the investigation, but that someone had either imperfect knowledge or was deliberately limiting disclosure to avoid revealing the full extent of government intelligence about network operations. During the search, one of the agents engaged Sarah in conversation that seemed designed to assess her knowledge and motivations. Agent Patricia Morrison, who introduced herself as a specialist in historical document authentication, spoke knowledgeably about Civil War intelligence operations and asked pointed questions about Sarah's research interests and sources of information. The conversation felt more like an interview than casual discussion, with Morrison probing for details about network contacts and repository contents while maintaining the pretense of professional curiosity. "Interesting property," Morrison commented while examining the area near the collapsed storm cellar. "Property records show some unusual construction activity during the 1860s. Must be fascinating to live on land with so much history." The comment was delivered casually, but it confirmed that government investigators possessed detailed knowledge of the site's historical significance and were fishing for information about current activities. Sarah responded with carefully neutral comments about her family's farming history, avoiding any references to discoveries or research that might confirm government suspicions. But Morrison's questions revealed the scope of official knowledge about network operations, while also suggesting boundaries to that knowledge. The government knew enough to target specific keepers and repositories, but apparently lacked complete understanding of network structure, communication methods, or the full extent of preserved materials. The search concluded without immediate discovery of the chamber, but Sarah understood that her reprieve was temporary. The warrant language and investigative approach suggested that government resources were being systematically deployed against network sites, with each search providing additional intelligence for future operations. The pressure was designed to force a choice: voluntary cooperation with government efforts to control network revelations, or escalating confrontation that could result in criminal prosecution or national security restrictions that would effectively end network operations. That evening, Sarah received an encrypted communication from Elena proposing an emergency meeting of all active keepers to vote on immediate implementation of graduated disclosure. Elena argued that government pressure had eliminated the luxury of extended deliberation about revelation timing. The network could either begin releasing materials on its own terms or face having those materials confiscated and either suppressed permanently or released selectively to serve government political purposes. Elena's message included intelligence from her university contacts suggesting that the academic counter-narrative campaign was preparation for a broader public relations offensive designed to discredit historical revisionism generally. Government strategists were apparently planning to use network revelations as examples of dangerous conspiracy, theorizing that threatened national unity and democratic institutions. By the time network materials entered public discourse, the intellectual and political framework for dismissing them would already be established. Sarah found herself facing the central dilemma that had confronted network keepers for over a century: how to balance preservation of democratic accountability with preservation of democratic institutions themselves. Government pressure was forcing a decision that previous generations of keepers had been able to postpone. But the choice between revelation and suppression could no longer be avoided. The chamber beneath her feet contained information that could reshape American political consciousness, but releasing that information might destabilize the very democratic system it was intended to protect. The external pressure had clarified the stakes, while eliminating comfortable assumptions about network autonomy and government respect for historical preservation. Sarah realized she was part of an organization that existed in a state of undeclared war with the government it sought to monitor, possessing weapons of information that could cause massive political damage, but facing an opponent with vastly superior resources and legal authority. The network's survival would depend on choices made by people like herself who had never expected to become participants in a struggle that would determine whether American democracy could tolerate complete honesty about its own history. Standing in her kitchen that night, listening for the sound of returning surveillance vehicles, Sarah Beth Kowalski understood that her role as keeper had evolved from historical preservation to active resistance against government efforts to control democratic discourse. The chamber below contained not just Lincoln's secrets, but the future of transparency in American democracy. And that future would be determined by decisions she could no longer postpone making. The network had reached a point where choosing preservation meant choosing confrontation, and choosing peace meant choosing suppression. Neither option offered certainty about protecting the democratic values that had justified the network's existence for over a century. The values-based resolution emerged from an unexpected source during the February network emergency meeting, when 17 keepers gathered in a hastily arranged location outside Topeka, Kansas, to determine the organization's response to escalating government pressure. Sarah had driven through the night to reach the abandoned grain elevator that served as their meeting site, a structure chosen specifically because its isolation and industrial purpose would not attract attention from surveillance teams that had been monitoring more obvious locations. The gathering represented the largest assembly of network keepers in over 40 years, and the diversity of perspectives quickly became apparent as each repository guardian shared their assessment of the current crisis. Helen maintained her traditional position, favoring measured response and long-term preservation of materials, arguing that premature disclosure would destroy the network's ability to serve future generations. Whitmore supported limited revelation of specific documents that could demonstrate government accountability without compromising national security. Elena continued advocating for comprehensive disclosure, insisting that democratic principles required immediate transparency regardless of political consequences. But it was Marcus Chen, the keeper responsible for the Pacific Coast Repository, who proposed the solution that would ultimately guide the network's response. Chen had inherited his responsibilities only 5 years earlier, but brought perspectives shaped by his background as a constitutional law professor and his family's experience with government surveillance during World War II. His grandfather had been interned during the war despite providing intelligence services to the federal government, and that family history had given Chen particular insight into the dangers of government secrecy unchecked by public accountability. We're approaching This as if we have only two choices, Chen argued, addressing the assembled keepers in the dim light of the grain elevator's interior. Either we reveal everything immediately and risk political chaos, or we continue preserving materials in secret and risk government confiscation. But there's a third option that honors both democratic transparency and institutional stability. We can begin selective revelation, while simultaneously ensuring that the full truth will eventually emerge, regardless of government interference. Chen's proposal involved what he called distributed revelation, a systematic program of releasing network materials through multiple channels simultaneously, making suppression impossible while providing sufficient context to minimize political disruption. Rather than dumping documents indiscriminately or waiting for perfect timing that might never arrive, the network would identify historians, journalists, and government officials who could be trusted to handle sensitive materials responsibly, and would provide them with carefully selected documents that told complete stories while protecting ongoing security interests. The key innovation in Chen's approach was the establishment of revelation insurance, secret agreements with trusted institutions that would automatically release comprehensive network materials if government pressure succeeded in destroying the organization or eliminating key keepers. Universities with strong traditions of academic freedom, international human rights organizations, and foreign institutions with interests in American historical accuracy would receive sealed collections that would be opened only if the network ceased to function effectively. Sarah found herself drawn to Chen's proposal because it addressed both Elena's moral urgency and Helen's practical caution, while providing protection against the government campaign that threatened to eliminate network autonomy entirely. The distributed revelation strategy would ensure that network materials entered public consciousness through legitimate channels that could provide appropriate context and analysis. The revelation insurance component would guarantee that government suppression efforts would ultimately prove counterproductive, deterring extreme measures while protecting the network's long-term mission. The debate over Chen's proposal revealed fundamental differences in how keepers understood their responsibilities to democratic accountability. Elena supported the plan enthusiastically, viewing it as validation of her arguments for immediate action. Helen expressed reservations about losing control over revelation timing, but acknowledged that government pressure had eliminated the luxury of indefinite postponement. Whitmore worried about operational security, but recognized that the current situation was unsustainable and required decisive response. Sarah spoke in favor of the proposal, drawing on her military experience to explain why strategic adaptation was necessary when operating environments changed dramatically. In Afghanistan, we learned that tactics effective in stable situations could become disastrous when circumstances shifted, she told the assembled keepers. The network was designed to operate in secrecy, but secrecy is no longer possible. We can either adapt to new realities or watch our mission fail because we refuse to change methods that no longer serve our purposes. The vote was closer than Chen had hoped, but decisive enough to provide clear direction. 12 keepers supported implementation of distributed revelation, with 5 preferring continued traditional methods. The minority was large enough to require accommodation in implementation planning, but the majority was sufficient to authorize fundamental changes in network operations. Sarah found herself appointed to the coordination committee responsible for identifying revelation partners and establishing revelation insurance agreements. Implementation began immediately, with each keeper tasked to identify potential revelation partners within their areas of expertise. Sarah's military background made her responsible for approaching veterans organizations, military historians, and congressional committees with oversight responsibilities for defense and intelligence operations. The goal was to identify individuals and institutions with both the credibility to handle sensitive materials responsibly and the independence to resist government pressure for suppression or distortion. The process proved more complex than anticipated, as many potential partners expressed reluctance to become involved in activities that might be viewed as unpatriotic or destabilizing. Military historians worried about losing access to official archives if they published materials that contradicted official narratives. Veterans organizations feared that revelations about government deception could undermine public support for military personnel and programs. Congressional staff members acknowledged the importance of historical accuracy, but questioned whether their oversight responsibilities extended to materials that had been classified for over a century. Sarah's breakthrough came through her contact with Dr. Angela Martinez, a historian at the Smithsonian Institution who specialized in Civil War intelligence operations. Martinez had spent years researching gaps in official records, trying to understand discrepancies between documented Union capabilities and acknowledged intelligence sources. When Sarah approached her with carefully selected samples from the Lincoln materials, Martinez immediately recognized their significance and authenticity. "These documents answer questions I've been researching for 20 years, Martinez explained during their meeting in her Smithsonian office. The gaps in official records always suggested that significant materials were being withheld, but I never imagined the scope was this extensive. If even a fraction of what you're showing me is representative of the complete collection, it would revolutionize understanding of Civil War-era governance and establish precedents for federal authority that extend far beyond anything currently acknowledged." Martinez proved ideal as a revelation partner because her institutional affiliation provided credibility, while her research background enabled her to understand the historical significance of network materials. She proposed a systematic publication program that would begin with academic articles in peer-reviewed journals, establishing scholarly legitimacy before moving to more accessible formats that could reach general audiences. The approach would provide time for historians to digest and debate revelations, while building intellectual frameworks for public understanding. The revelation insurance component proved equally successful, with institutions in Canada, the United Kingdom and Switzerland agreeing to serve as backup repositories for complete network collections. These arrangements were structured as academic exchanges, with materials provided under research agreements that would automatically convert to public access if the network ceased to function. The agreements included financial endowments sufficient to support publication and analysis costs, ensuring that revelation would occur regardless of political interference or funding pressures. Sarah's role in coordinating these arrangements brought her into contact with international scholars and human rights advocates who provided sobering perspectives on American democratic institutions. Dr. James Crawford, a constitutional law professor at Oxford University, who agreed to serve as a revelation insurance partner, explained that European scholars had long suspected that American historical narratives omitted significant information about government operations during formative periods. The United States has always presented itself as exceptional among democracies, uniquely transparent and accountable to its citizens, Crawford observed during their meeting in London. But that presentation has required maintaining comfortable myths about how democratic institutions actually function. European democracies have generally been more honest about the moral complexity of governance, the necessity of occasional deception, and the importance of mechanisms for eventual accountability. Americans may find it more difficult to accept that their government has always operated within these same realities. The international perspective helped Sarah understand that network revelations would challenge not just specific historical narratives, but fundamental assumptions about American exceptionalism that shaped national identity. The materials preserved in network repositories documented systematic government deception, foreign intervention, and domestic surveillance that contradicted popular beliefs about American moral superiority and institutional transparency. Revelations would force citizens to confront the possibility that their democracy had always functioned through methods they associated with authoritarian regimes. As distributed revelation implementation proceeded, Sarah found herself serving as liaison between the network and revelation partners who required ongoing support and guidance. The role involved more than providing documents. She became responsible for helping historians, journalists, and other analysts understand the context and significance of materials that often contradicted everything they had previously believed. About American political development, the work was emotionally demanding because it required her to repeatedly witness the same psychological process she had experienced when first discovering the chamber contents. Each revelation partner went through stages of disbelief, anger, disappointment, and eventual acceptance as they processed evidence that fundamental assumptions about American history were false or incomplete. Sarah found herself serving as counselor and guide for people who were discovering that their professional expertise and patriotic beliefs had been based on systematically distorted information. But the work was also deeply satisfying because it fulfilled the network's fundamental mission of preserving democratic accountability while adapting to contemporary realities. Rather than waiting indefinitely for perfect timing that might never arrive, the network was ensuring that critical information entered public consciousness through legitimate channels that could provide appropriate context and analysis. The distributed approach protected both historical accuracy and political stability while establishing precedents for transparency that could influence future government behavior. The government response to distributed revelation was swift, but ultimately counterproductive. Attempts to intimidate revelation partners through surveillance and bureaucratic pressure only confirmed the importance of the materials they were handling and strengthened their commitment to publication. Academic institutions rallied to defend scholarly freedom when federal agencies attempted to influence editorial decisions at peer-reviewed journals. International partners provided alternative publication venues when domestic pressure became excessive. Most importantly, the revelation insurance arrangements had their intended deterrent effect. Government officials recognized that aggressive suppression efforts would trigger comprehensive disclosure that would be far more damaging than the measured revelation program the network had implemented. The distributed approach had eliminated the government's ability to control information release while providing face-saving alternatives to direct confrontation. Standing in her kitchen 6 months after the emergency meeting, reading Dr. Martinez's first published article about Civil War intelligence operations, Sarah realized that the network had successfully navigated its greatest crisis by choosing adaptation over preservation, transparency over secrecy, and democratic accountability over institutional comfort. The chamber beneath her feet remained secure, but its contents were beginning their journey into public consciousness through channels that honored both historical accuracy and democratic stability. The values-based resolution had required the network to abandon comfortable assumptions about indefinite secrecy while maintaining commitment to responsible revelation that served democratic rather than destructive purposes. Sarah had discovered that protecting democratic accountability sometimes required risking democratic institutions, but that calculated risks taken with proper preparation and broad support could strengthen rather than weaken the foundations of democratic governance. The full circle moment arrived 18 months later on a crisp October morning that mirrored the day Sarah had first discovered the collapsed storm cellar. She stood in the same spot where her journey had begun, but everything around her had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The farm looked identical. The same cornfield stretched to the horizon. The same farmhouse sat solid and weathered against the Illinois sky, but the land now carried weight that went far beyond its agricultural value. Dr. Martinez's revelations had sparked what historians were calling the New Reconstruction, a comprehensive re-examination of American political development that extended far beyond Civil War-era materials. The careful, scholarly approach the network had chosen proved prescient as academic institutions, government agencies, and international observers worked together to process discoveries that challenged fundamental assumptions about democratic governance. Rather than triggering political chaos, the revelations had initiated productive conversations about transparency, accountability, and the moral complexity of leadership in democratic societies. Sarah's role had evolved from accidental discoverer to active participant in reshaping American historical consciousness. She testified before congressional committees, consulted with documentary filmmakers, and worked with educators, developing curricula that incorporated network revelations while maintaining respect for democratic institutions. The process was exhausting but deeply satisfying, fulfilling her sense of service in ways that military deployment had never achieved. The chamber beneath her feet remained active, but its purpose had fundamentally changed. Rather than serving as a secret repository for materials too sensitive for public consumption, it had become a research center where scholars from around the world came to study primary sources that provided unprecedented insight into the practical challenges of democratic governance. The network had evolved from shadow organization to transparent institution, maintaining its commitment to historical preservation while abandoning the secrecy that had once seemed essential to its mission. Elena had proved prophetic in her arguments for immediate disclosure. The graduated revelation program had succeeded precisely because it trusted democratic institutions and citizens to handle difficult truths responsibly. American society had demonstrated remarkable resilience in processing revelations that might have been destabilizing if released through less careful channels. Public opinion polls showed that citizens felt stronger confidence in democratic institutions after learning about their historical complexity, rather than weaker confidence in institutions that had been revealed as imperfect. The international response had been equally positive, with foreign governments expressing appreciation for American willingness to acknowledge historical mistakes and institutional limitations. Rather than damaging American credibility, the revelations had enhanced it by demonstrating that American democracy was mature enough to confront uncomfortable truths about its own development. The Transparency Initiative had become a model for other nations grappling with difficult histories and competing demands for accountability and stability. Sarah's personal transformation paralleled the network's institutional evolution. The isolation and psychological burden that had characterized her early months as a keeper had given way to a sense of community and purpose that connected her to historians, activists, and ordinary citizens who shared commitment to democratic accountability. The secrets that had once separated her from normal social relationships had become bridges, connecting her to people who understood that democracy required both idealism and realism, both faith in principles and acknowledgement of human limitations. The Medal of Honor in her bedroom closet had taken on new meaning as well. Rather than representing a burden of heroism that separated her from ordinary humanity, it had become a symbol of the service that democracy required from all citizens. Her military heroism and her civilian guardianship of historical truth were different expressions of the same commitment to preserving something larger than individual comfort or convenience. The medal honored not just her actions in Afghanistan, but her willingness to risk personal security for democratic principles. Helen had adapted to the network's transformation with characteristic grace, acknowledging that circumstances had required changes she had initially resisted. Her Springfield facility had become a training center for new keepers and revelation partners, providing expertise developed over decades of managing sensitive historical materials. The older generation's caution and the younger generation's urgency had combined to create approaches that balanced competing demands more effectively than either perspective could achieve alone. Whitmore had found particular satisfaction in the military aspects of the Revelation program, as documents about controversial operations were finally providing context for decisions that had troubled him for decades. Veterans of conflicts from Vietnam through Afghanistan were learning that their doubts about official narratives had been justified, that moral complexity they had experienced personally was reflected in institutional records that validated rather than dismissed their concerns. The Revelation program had provided closure for military personnel who had carried burdens of knowledge they could never previously share. But the most significant change was in Sarah's understanding of patriotism itself. Military service had taught her that loving your country sometimes required risking your life for its protection. Network service had taught her that loving your country sometimes required risking your reputation for its improvement. Both forms of service demanded courage, but they required different kinds of bravery. Physical courage in military settings, moral courage in civilian contexts. The chamber had become a pilgrimage site for people seeking to understand how democracy actually functioned rather than how they wished it functioned. Students, scholars, journalists, and ordinary citizens came to examine documents that revealed the gap between democratic ideals and democratic practice, while also demonstrating the mechanisms through which that gap could be gradually narrowed. The revelations had not destroyed faith in democratic institutions, but had provided more realistic foundations for that faith. Sarah often found herself thinking about Lincoln during these visits, imagining how he might have responded to seeing his carefully preserved secrets become tools for democratic education rather than weapons for political destruction. The continuity protocol had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations, preserving not just information, but the principle that democracy required citizens willing to shoulder difficult responsibilities for the sake of future generations. The network's transformation had inspired similar initiatives in other countries, with nations around the world establishing their own systems for preserving sensitive historical materials while ensuring eventual public access. The American experiment in distributed revelation had demonstrated that democratic societies could handle difficult truths if those truths were presented through legitimate institutions with appropriate context and analysis. Transparency had proven strengthening rather than weakening when implemented thoughtfully and responsibly. As evening approached on this anniversary of her discovery, Sarah found herself returning to the chamber one final time before the day ended. The space looked different now, well-lit, climate-controlled, organized for researchers rather than hidden from discovery. Display cases held original documents alongside explanatory materials that helped visitors understand their historical significance. Computer terminals provided access to digitized collections that scholars around the world could access for analysis and verification. But the essential character of the space remained unchanged. It was still a place where the past spoke to the present, where the complexity of democratic governance was preserved for future generations to study and understand. The chamber honored both the necessity of occasional secrecy and the importance of eventual transparency, demonstrating that democratic institutions could evolve and improve when citizens were willing to confront difficult truths about their own history. Standing in the chamber where her journey had begun, Sarah realized that the most important discovery had not been Lincoln's documents, but her own capacity to serve democracy in ways she had never imagined. The chamber had called her back not just to historical truth, but to contemporary responsibility, not just to preservation, but to active citizenship in a democracy that required both protection and improvement. The young veteran who had sought refuge in farming had become a guardian of democratic accountability, but she had also discovered that guardianship required community rather than isolation, transparency rather than secrecy, and faith in citizens' capacity to handle truth responsibly. The chamber would continue serving future generations, but it would serve them as evidence that democracy could survive and thrive when its citizens chose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and service over security. Democracy, Sarah had learned, was not a finished achievement, but an ongoing experiment that required each generation to choose between competing values and responsibilities. The network had chosen transparency over secrecy, accountability over comfort, and future service over present safety. Those choices had been vindicated by results that strengthened rather than weakened democratic institutions, but they required constant renewal by citizens willing to shoulder similar responsibilities. The chamber below would wait for the next generation of guardians, but it would wait not as a burden to be born in isolation, but as an opportunity to serve something larger than individual interests. Democracy required heroes, but it also required ordinary citizens willing to do extraordinary things when circumstances demanded courage, wisdom, and commitment to principles that transcended personal convenience. If this story of hidden truth and democratic courage moved you, if it reminded you that sometimes the most important revelations come not from those in power, but from ordinary citizens willing to bear extraordinary responsibilities, then perhaps it's time to consider your own role in preserving and protecting the democracy we've inherited. Like this video, if you believe that truth and transparency strengthen rather than weaken democratic institutions, subscribe to our channel if you want to hear more stories about ordinary people who discovered that serving democracy sometimes requires risking everything comfortable and familiar for the sake of something larger than themselves. Because the most important secrets aren't always the ones kept by governments. Sometimes they're the ones we keep from ourselves about what citizenship actually requires when democracy needs defending.